Your wounds are showing. Bias is not sin. Bias is a leaning. It's like a hangover after you had too much to drink. It cripples your intelligence, it freezes your emotions, it makes you miserable. And what can you do about it? Okay, so that's what we're going to be talking about. So I'm going to ask Phil to show the second slide right away. And I'm going to show you a little bit of a different way of looking at the human being. These two circles of reality are not separate. What I want you to get a feel for is taking that drawing and going, so it becomes a unified whole. But we do need to talk about the functions of the different dimensions of the human. And it's not hard. When we're talking about the human organism, we're talking about our physicality. We're talking about certain systems. If we had time to really, do this in an extended way, we would say, what are the functioning systems in the organism? Well, you'd start with digestion, respiration, elimination, reproduction. They're all very familiar to us. And where do we go when they're not functioning correctly? We go to the doctor. Okay? We have another dimension to ourselves, which is a magnetic field of imagery, emotion. When imagery really tells a story, then we have imagination. And then we have fantasy, which is really imaging with desire connected to it. We have instincts and emotions. This what we call the psychic somatic part of our humanness, we share with the animal world very, very closely. Now, to expand on that emotion a bit, you'll see on this sketch that there are two kinds. Now, from Aquinas, you have the term irascible and concupiscible, and nobody knows what that means. So the psychiatrists that are coming out of Aquinas today will talk about the considered and the spontaneous emotions. The spontaneous emotions are much more connected with physicality, with the organism, and the considered emotions are much more connected with the human spirit. And I'm not talking about religion here. I'm talking about what is constitutive to your humanness, even if you're an atheist. So the human spirit has two major functions. And we call the first one intelligence and the other choice or volition. This whole dimension of the human is together. Now, I'm going to ask you, before we leave this slide, to just look where that overlap is, okay? Just keep that in your mind's eye, because we're going to be talking about that overlap and the human spirit, especially intelligence, and what the wounds are that can shut those functions down because they're subconscious. That middle link there is subconscious. We bring it up into consciousness when we get aware of it in the human cognition, in the first stage of the intellect, okay? But most of the woundedness, most of what we have experienced as a child or domestic abuse, I just read yesterday of a kid who was every week beaten up by his father, and then watched the dad beat up his mother. What is buried in that psychic field from memory with someone who has experienced that, or someone who has experienced incest, or racial prejudice, or oppression because they are Caribbean, or oppression because they're Asian? We have hidden woundedness, and that psychic area no one escapes from. There is a special kind of woundedness that each one of us carries from our infancy, from our first grade and our preschool experience that we don't even remember anymore. But it forms our personality. It makes us hesitant. It makes us silent, or we are afraid to speak out, or it makes us fly off the temper, the handle very quickly, because we've learned how to protect ourselves from those who have been kind of brutalizing us. Now, what we're going to look at is how bias enters one of the biases enters into that psychic middle area and will shut down any images that have to do with what you were how you were abused or injured before the age of 4. Okay, and that is the bias of what we call dramatic. Dramatic bias is coming from PTSD of some form. And it won't even allow you to bring forth images that had to do with that kind of experience because it's too painful. And so from the depths of your subconsciousness, dramatic bias will cripple you from getting the images you need for your intelligence to have a phantasm to start to ask questions about. You don't want to go there because it just registers in your feeling memory that it's too painful. So there are two ways to heal what is called dramatic bias. One is therapy. What is therapy? Therapy is when the person who is walking with you calls you to really face those images, to bring the memory back up into the first part of intelligence where you're aware. And then they help you by their skill, because you're not alone, to say to that woundedness, you are not going to rule my life. And then you fast on memories that bring you back to that image. And you say, nope, I ain't going there. And you use a fasting technique just as if you had what we would, a remote control when you change a channel on a TV screen. You don't like it. We have the capacity, once we know what our dramatic bias is, to say, nope, I'm not going there. Nope, it's not going to rule me. It is not going to influence my values, my decisions, and what I want to look into. The other curative for what I'm calling dramatic bias, which is in that psychic field, is contemplative prayer with tears. What did people do before they had therapists? They would pray and weep. And tears, the gift of tears, has the capacity to cleanse the psyche. It's very interesting. All right, I'm going to ask Phil if you go to the next slide. And now we're going to talk about it in terms of that drawing, that sketch. Keep that in mind. 3 dimensions: my physicality, my organism, my physical organism, my psychic field with the functions of imaging, imagining, fantasizing, 11 powerful emotions, and dreaming, some instinctual things, most of it subconscious. And then our marvelous intelligence and our value judgments that allow us to choose among options with cognition, not just instinct, distinguishes us from the animal world. We have a spiritual dimension, whether we admit it or not, whether we are religious or not. We are spiritual beings. Why? Because we have an openness to our consciousness. We are open to transcendence. And that means that the sky is the limit. It's something like being in a stadium that has a retractable roof. If it doesn't have a retractable roof and you look up, what do you see? You see the roof at a night game. If it has a retractable roof, you look up at night and you see stars. You know they're there, but you don't know what they are. Our consciousness has the ability to go into the possible. The possible. As far as we know, animals do not have that function in their consciousness, but they are conscious. It's just more limited in regard to both self-reflection and transcendence. So we are spiritual beings who can be in touch with transcendence. And we have, in our different faith traditions, we have different ways of naming that mystery that we call God. So if you look down, what am I talking about? I'm not talking about sin. I'm talking about the effects of sin and the woundedness. It's a woundedness. It's the hangover. Second, it is self-centered narcissism. The root is because it is my self-love that makes me and my ego the three most important people in the world: me, myself, and I. There are 4 of these biases, and believe it or not, psycho-spiritual writers who know Lonergan's works have not been able to come up with a 5th. Now you're going to see why in a few minutes. The first, there they are. They're bolded. The first bias is called individual egoism, and it occurs in the first level of conscious intelligence. Those first 3 biases are cognitive. They are intellectual. The bottom one is dramatic bias that doesn't even let you get to a picture to start the cognitive process. The sense data, because it's too painful. I'm not going there. So let's look at these. They will be so familiar to you, you'll laugh. The first one is called individual egoism, my way or the highway. I don't want to hear what your opinion is. I've decided what my decision is, and you just mix me up. You just confuse me. No, I'm settled, dear. No, I know what I believe, and you don't have anything you can tell me. When you expand this communally, you have group egoism. We're superior, and that makes you inferior. You say, well, I think I know what that is. That's racism. That's, putting people down because of their religion. That's sexism. That's any ism, nationalism, fascism, any ism you can name belongs under group egoism. Now, egoism in Catholic and Christian understanding of the ego is different from Hinduism and Buddhism, the Asian faiths. In the more Asian faiths, the ego is a problem. You want to get rid of it. In Christianity, you don't get rid of your ego. You wash your windows. Egoism is opaqueness. You can't see in, you can't see out. You just project yourself. When the windows get washed, you can see in and you can see out. You have a clear window. It's transparency. They use that word very, very often in business today. Be transparent. Be transparent. They don't know what they're talking about. It's deeply spiritual. It's deeply spiritual. It is a purified ego, and that's what Lent is all about. Purifying the ego. In other words, God puts an apron on and he washes windows. He comes to visit you with Windex. That's real conversion. That's when, well, we'll talk about what they're just a humorous way of remembering egoism and what its effects, what its functions are. When you have an egotistical consciousness, there are 6 signs that you will learn to recognize, and they'll be all too familiar for you. So we'll get there at the end. My way or the highway, individual egoism. Our way or the highway. Our business is better. Yours is not worth anything. Our country is superior. You don't know anything. We know exactly what to do about this. We're the best, and nobody can tell us anything. Sounds rather adolescent, doesn't it? General bias is the most simple of all. I don't want to learn about that because I might change my mind. I don't want to do any study about that because I might think differently. It's a form of anti-intellectualism, however you paint it, all right? So there are your intellectual biases, the top 3, and we already were introduced to the most basic one of all, the dramatic bias, by which my psychic field has memories that prevent me from even going to certain images to start the cognitive process. Okay, let's move on. So where is it? We've looked at the 3 dimensions of humanness, the organism, the psychic field, and the human spirit. And I'd like to just spend a few minutes talking about what I'm calling psychic somatic experience and psycho-spiritual experience. This is human constitutive experience, plus or minus, negative or positive. And what role then does religion play in this humanness that we're describing? Religions are tremendous wisdom faith traditions. They are coaches for your spirituality. And so for those of you who have beloved nephews or nieces who say, I don't need any of those religions, I'm spiritual. If they were going to the Olympics and they said to you, coach, I don't have one, I think you'd say, good luck, kiddo. Well, that's about as wise as someone who thinks they see clearly when very often their woundedness is showing and they are very egotistical and they think they know it all. Guess what that is? Now, the functions, we're familiar now with them, respiration, digestion, etc. But we're not familiar with those 2 other dimensions. That's why I spent so much time on them. When people say, how's your psychological life? We look at them with a blank stare because we don't know how to monitor it. We can say, I have a very active dream life. I have a very active emotional life. I have a wonderful imagination, and my imagery is not unbounded. Well, then you're pretty healthy psychologically. If any of those is impinged upon, you're wounded psychologically, and it's probably some form of dramatic bias. The spiritual functions are even more obtuse if you ask people what their spiritual functions are. Well, there's even one before understanding. And the one before understanding is wonder and amazement and just being aware of what's going on around you. Plain awareness, being in tune. Then the questions start to come, and you seek understanding of what you're experiencing. And if you keep at it, eventually you'll make an intellectual judgment of fact. If you've got enough data and you've got some understanding of what the data means, that's cognitive, that's your intellect. It's a process. It's not a thing in your head. It's a function of your soul, of your human spirit, that, as far as we know, cannot be matched by any of the species in the animal kingdom. And then finally, you evaluate, choose, and decide and act out something, and that's your vision, that's your volitional, or what we used to say called the will. But the intellect and the will are static terms. Plunk. You just plunk them out on a paper or plunk them out. You say them and they're gone. So we're talking more about intelligence today functionally. We're talking more about will today volitionally. Now, in order to understand the biases, let's go to the next. We have to be aware of what we can do about our biases once we realize how prejudiced we are and how really we live with white privilege, how much we want to say, I'm not racist. Oh, I'm not racist. No, I respect everybody. You cannot escape the fact that you live under white privilege. It comes with your birth certificate. And you will act out of that privilege before, without your even knowing you are doing so, because it's like a second skin. And so we all have to work on naming it. And this comes from the Jesuits. You probably have heard this before. Name whatever is your wound. Claim it, it's yours. It may not be your neighbor's, because their experience differs from yours. Don't blame it. It's a wound. You don't pick at or pound at a wound. You heal it. You take care of it. This is the after effects of what someone has done to you or you've done to yourself. And then you tame it. Then you decide how it's going to control or not control you. You name it, which means you bring it into consciousness from the psychic field where it's subconscious. You claim it. It's mine. I need to deal with it. I'm not going to excuse myself or say, I don't need to listen to you. I don't need to listen to anybody. I know what I'm doing and I know where I'm going. Remember, even good drivers have a blind spot. Don't beat it up. Don't abuse your wound and rip it off and make the scab worse. Now, I'm using physical language, but very, very often we've got to use metaphorical language to talk about the psychic field and about spiritual woundedness. You tame it by intentionally doing the opposite. When someone is terrified, very easily, they're frightened to speak before a group or whatever, they begin slowly, they can tame their fear and learn to do public speaking. there's a whole set of courses to teach you how to do that. The final step here is to love, to forgive, and to thank. The particular woundedness that each of us suffers, whether it's individual egoism, group egoism with a prejudice of some kind, or I don't want to learn about that because then I might have to think differently. General bias. I don't, I'd rather be active. I never check on how my intellectual edge is growing. I just figure I know enough. I don't have to do that stuff. I'm a very, very practical person. And finally, thanksgiving, forgiving, and love is where God grabs you. When grace grabs hold of a person, it heals, it frees, and it brings joy, and it heals the biases in a person. Now, how do you recognize if you're egotistical in one way or the other? And I'll stop with this, and then we'll open it up for questions. There are some humorous ways you can help people with this. I call it, there are 3 sisty ugglers. You say, what? Well, that's a play on Ugly Sisters from Cinderella. There's 3 sisty ugglers. And then there's the 3 beastly brothers. So you have 6 ways you'll always recognize egoism of one form or another. It's like when you have a hangover, or it's like when you have a fever or a headache coming on, okay? On the physical level. The 3 sisty ugglers all rhyme. You'll recognize the triplet: shaming, blaming, and complaining. Shaming, blaming, and complaining. Yourself or somebody else. It doesn't matter. You can be the object of it, or somebody else can be the object of it. It's a form of ego overheatedness. It's a fever. You got a fever. Psycho-spiritually, you got a fever. The 3 beastly brothers are all W's. Worrying or what-ifing. Are you having trouble with that? Or you worry and you say, what if this happens? What if I didn't pay enough insurance? What if and you get yourself in a snit and you're miserable. And then something happens and it was all for nothing. You wasted all that mental time worrying. The solution to that is nip it in the bud. When something really happens in the present, that will be time to deal with it. In the meantime, don't make yourself a basket case. So worrying or what-ifing, they're the same thing. What if? The second is withdrawal. I want to be alone. You avoid community. You avoid talking with someone who might help you. You withdraw and isolate yourself. That's a form of egoism. Okay? And finally, whining. Worry, withdrawal, and whining are the 3 beastly brothers. And they will come and visit you. Or the 3 sisty ugglers, they will try to make a home in you. This is how you can name, claim, tame your own woundedness. So I'm going to stop there. There may be much you question about this.